wanted bandit took in an orphan, until the child called him father in front of the law. The most wanted man in 3 territories found himself face to face with the one thing that could destroy him. Not a bullet or a noose, but a small boy's tears mixing with his parents' blood in the desert dust. The train had bled money and screams into the Nevada dust, but Jake Morrison felt nothing as he stuffed the last of the bills into his saddlebags. 20 years of robbing and killing had carved the feeling clean out of him, left him hollow as a dried riverbed. The other men were already riding hard for the hills, their whoops and hollers fading into the desert wind, but Jake lingered. Something felt wrong. Not the robbery. That had gone smooth as silk. Something else. Something in the air that tasted of more than gunpowder and fear. He turned his horse toward the cluster of overturned wagons beyond the tracks, where passengers had tried to make their stand. Most folks called him Blackwater Jake, on account of the way he could look at a man and make his blood run cold. But standing there in the afternoon heat, watching the desert wind lift the edges of scattered papers and torn fabric, Jake felt something stir in his chest that he'd thought was long dead. The first wagon held an old drummer, shot clean through. The second, a young couple from back east, their fine clothes now soaked with more than sweat. Jake had seen plenty of death. Hell, he'd caused most of it. But something made him walk further. Maybe it was the silence. Too much silence, even for the desert. That's when he heard it. A sound so small it might have been the wind through a cactus flower. A whimper, soft and broken, like a wounded animal. Jake drew his Colt and moved toward the third wagon, its canvas top shredded by bullets. The sound came again, and this time he knew what it was. He'd heard that same sound 20 years ago, crying in a burning cabin while Apache raiders rode away into the night. It was the sound of a child who'd lost everything. Under the wagon's shadow, pressed against the back wheel, sat a boy. Couldn't have been more than 7 or 8 years old, with sandy hair and eyes the color of creek water. His clothes were torn and dusty, and his small hands were pressed tight against his mouth, as if he could hold back all the terror that wanted to spill out. Jake holstered his gun slow and careful. The boy's eyes followed every movement, wide and unblinking. There was blood on his shirt, not his own, Jake realized. His parents' blood. The man and woman lying twisted in the wagon bed above. Easy now, Jake heard himself say, his voice rusty from disuse. Why had he last spoken gentle words to anyone? Easy, boy. The child didn't move, didn't speak, just stared at Jake with those creek water eyes, and something in that gaze hit harder than any bullet Jake had ever taken. This boy was seeing him, not Blackwater Jake the killer, but him, the man he used to be before the Apache took his own family. Before grief turned to rage, and rage to something darker. Jake crouched down, keeping his distance. "What's your name, son?" The boy's lips moved, but no sound came out. His gaze flicked to the wagon bed, to the still forms of his parents, then back to Jake. In that look, Jake saw his own childhood self, the boy who'd crawled out of a burning cabin, who'd walked 3 days through desert heat to reach the nearest town, who'd learned that the world was a place where everything you loved could be torn away in a single, bloody moment. "Timothy," the boy finally whispered, his voice barely there. "My name is Timothy." Jake nodded slow. "Timothy. That's a good, strong name." He glanced at the wagon, at the bodies cooling in the desert heat. No one should have to see their parents like that. No one should have to carry that weight. "You hurt anywhere, Timothy?" The boy shook his head, but his eyes never left Jake's face. Smart kid. Old enough to know that the man crouched before him was dangerous. Young enough to hope he might also be kind. In the distance, Jake could hear riders approaching. Not his men. They'd be halfway to Mexico by now. These were different hoofbeats. Steady and determined. The law, most likely, or bounty hunters following the blood trail he'd left across 3 territories. Either way, they'd shoot first and ask questions of his corpse. Jake should have mounted up and ridden hard. Should have left the boy to whatever mercy the desert and the strangers might offer. That was what Blackwater Jake would do. What he'd done 100 times before. But looking at Timothy, seeing the way the child's small hand reached toward him despite everything, Jake found himself doing something he hadn't done in 20 years. He made a choice that had nothing to do with money or survival or with the cold logic that had kept him alive. He made a choice that came from whatever piece of his soul the desert hadn't yet claimed. "Come on, Timothy," Jake said, extending his hand. "We need to go." The boy hesitated for just a moment. Then his small fingers wrapped around Jake's calloused palm, and something shifted in the desert air, something that felt dangerously close to hope. As they rode away from the blood and the silence, Timothy's arms wrapped tight around Jake's waist. The killer found himself wondering if maybe, just maybe, there was still something worth saving in the wasteland his life had become. The desert wind carried their tracks away into the gathering dusk, but some things Jake was beginning to understand couldn't be erased so easily. Some things, once chosen, changed a man forever. For 20 years, Jake Morrison had been the nightmare parents used to scare their children into bed, until a small boy taught the killer how to be human again, one shared meal at a time. 3 months had passed since Jake carried Timothy away from the blood-soaked train tracks, and the hidden canyon had become something neither of them had expected: home. Carved deep into the red rock by centuries of flash floods, the canyon offered water from a spring that never ran dry, shelter from the wind, and most importantly, complete invision from the outside world. Here, where the walls rose 200 feet toward a ribbon of blue sky, Jake Morrison wasn't Blackwater Jake anymore. He was just a man trying to figure out how to care for a boy who called him nothing at all. Timothy still didn't speak much. Not about his parents, not about the train, not about the nightmares that woke him crying in the darkness. But he listened, watched everything Jake did with those creekwater eyes, soaking up lessons in survival like desert sand soaks up rain. "See how the rabbit tracks cross here?" Jake pointed to marks in the dust near the spring. His voice had grown softer over the weeks, gentler than it had been in 20 years. "They come to drink at dawn and dusk, never in the heat of day." Timothy nodded, tracing the small prints with his finger. He was learning to read the desert's language, how to spot the difference between snake tracks and lizard trails, how to tell fresh horse droppings from old, how to find water by following the flight of birds. Jake taught him because keeping the boy alive meant keeping them both hidden, but somewhere along the way, the lessons had become something more. They had become a father teaching his son. The thought hit Jake one morning as he watched Timothy practice with the small bow Jake had carved for him. The boy's tongue stuck out in concentration, his brow furrowed with the serious business of trying to hit a target chalked on the canyon wall. When the arrow finally found its mark, Timothy's face lit up with pure joy, and he turned to Jake with a smile that could have melted stone. Did you see, Jake? I hit it." Jake had seen plenty of men die, had watched towns burn and banks empty and justice crumble into dust. But he'd never seen anything quite like Timothy's smile in that moment. It did something to his chest, made it tight and warm and uncomfortable in a way that had nothing to do with the desert heat. "I saw," Jake said, and found himself smiling back. "Real good shooting, Timothy. Your pa would be proud." The words came out before Jake could stop them, and both of them went still. Timothy's smile faded, and for a moment, the ghosts of the train robbery stood between them. The boy's real father, the man Jake's bullets had made into memory and grief. But Timothy didn't cry. Instead, he walked over to Jake and did something that stopped the outlaw's heart cold. The boy leaned against his side, small and trusting, and said quietly, he would. "But so are you." That evening, as they sat around their small fire sharing beans and hardtack, Jake found himself telling stories. Not the dark tales of his outlaw years, but older stories. Stories from before the blood and the running, when he'd been a different man with a different name. "My ma used to make cornbread so good, it could make a grown man weep," Jake said, staring into the flames. "She'd bake in a cast-iron pot, right over coals like these. Golden brown on top, soft as clouds inside." Timothy listened with the intensity he brought to everything, memorizing each word. "What happened to her?" Jake's throat tightened. "Apache raid. Long time ago. I wasn't much older than you when they took everything." The boy was quiet for a while, processing this. Then, in that way children have of cutting straight to the heart of things, he said, Is that why you got so angry? Why you became an outlaw? No one had ever asked Jake that question. Not in 20 years of running and hiding and killing. They'd asked him about money, about plans, about revenge. But no one had ever asked about the grief that lived in his bones like winter cold. Yeah, Jake said finally. I reckon it is. Timothy poked at the fire with a stick, sending sparks dancing up toward the stars. My pa used to read to me from a Bible. He said anger was like carrying hot coals. You're the one who gets burned. Jake laughed, but it came out rough and broken. Smart man, your pa. He was. Timothy looked up at Jake, and in his eyes was something that made the outlaw's breath catch. Understanding. Forgiveness. Love. But you're not angry anymore, are you, Jake? Not like before. Jake stared at the boy, this child who'd lost everything but somehow still had room in his heart for hope, for trust, for a killer who didn't deserve either. Timothy was right. The anger that had driven Jake for 20 years, that had turned him into Blackwater Jake, was fading, being replaced by something infinitely more dangerous and infinitely more precious. Care, protection, love. The boy fell asleep against Jake's shoulder that night, and as Jake carried him to his bedroll, he found himself humming an old song his mother had sung, something about home being where the heart finds peace. He hadn't thought about that song in 20 years, hadn't thought about peace in longer than that. But here, in this hidden canyon with a boy who looked at him like he hung the stars, Jake Morrison was beginning to remember what it felt like to be more than just a ghost haunting the desert. He was beginning to remember what it felt like to be a man worth loving. As the fire burned down to embers and Timothy's breathing grew deep and steady, Jake found himself making promises in the darkness. Promises to protect this boy, to be worthy of his trust, to become the man Timothy already seemed to see in him. But promises, Jake knew, were dangerous things in the desert. They had a way of demanding more than a man was prepared to give. The fever was burning the boy alive, and Jake Morrison faced an impossible choice. Watch Timothy die in their hidden sanctuary, or risk everything by carrying him into a town where wanted posters bore his face on every wall. The fever came like a thief in the night, stealing Timothy's strength and leaving him burning hot against Jake's chest. For 2 days, Jake had tried everything he knew: cool water from the spring, willow bark tea, prayers he'd forgotten how to say. But the boy's skin blazed like desert stone at noon, and his breathing came shallow and fast, like a wounded animal's last gasps. Jake had delivered death to dozens of men, but he'd never felt as helpless as he did watching Timothy slip away one labored breath at a time. The boy mumbled in his delirium, calling for his mother, his father, sometimes just crying out in pain that cut Jake deeper than any bullet ever had. On the third morning, Timothy's lips had turned blue around the edges, and Jake knew he was out of time. Mercy Creek was 8 miles south through the desert, a small cattle town that barely rated a dot on most maps. Jake had scouted it weeks ago: one main street, a handful of buildings, and most importantly, a doctor. He'd also seen the wanted posters nailed to every post and wall, his own face staring back at him with dead eyes and a $500 bounty underneath. But as Timothy's fever climbed higher, Jake realized that some things mattered more than staying hidden. Some things were worth dying for. He wrapped the boy in blankets, mounted his horse with Timothy cradled against his chest, and rode toward Mercy Creek like a man riding toward his own hanging. Every mile brought him closer to capture, closer to the noose that had been waiting for him for 20 years. But Timothy's life was slipping away with each heartbeat, and Jake would face 1,000 sheriffs before he'd let that happen. The town was quiet in the late afternoon heat when Jake rode down Main Street. A few people stopped to stare at the stranger carrying a sick child, but no one raised an alarm. Not yet. Jake's hat was pulled low, and dust covered most of his face. He might have been any drifter seeking help for a dying boy. Dr. Henley's office sat next to the barber shop, a small wooden sign swinging in the hot wind. Jake dismounted and carried Timothy through the door, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. The doctor was a thin man with kind eyes and gentle hands, the sort of man Jake had learned not to trust 20 years ago. But desperation made strange bedfellows. "Please," Jake said, his voice cracking like a boy's. "He's burning up. Been like this for 3 days. Dr. Henley took one look at Timothy's flushed face and motioned toward a small bed in the back room. "Lay him down here." "How long has he had the fever?" Jake placed Timothy on the bed as gently as laying down a sleeping angel. "Started Monday night. I tried willow bark, cold water, everything I could think of." The doctor began his examination, feeling Timothy's forehead, listening to his chest, checking his pulse. Jake stood back in the shadows, keeping his face turned away from the window where afternoon light might reveal too much. But his eyes never left Timothy. "Looks like pneumonia," Dr. Henley said finally. "Common enough in children, but dangerous if left untreated. You did right bringing him in." That's when Timothy opened his eyes. The fever had broken his defenses, left him confused and frightened. He saw Jake standing in the shadows and reached out with a small, trembling hand. "Father," he whispered, his voice barely audible, but carrying across the small room like thunder. "Father, don't leave me." The word hit Jake like a physical blow. Father. Not Jake. Not the name of an outlaw or a killer. Father. The word he dreamed of hearing 20 years ago, before the Apache took his wife and unborn child. The word that meant everything and changed everything and damned them both. Dr. Henley looked up sharply, studying Jake's face in the lamplight. Recognition dawned in his eyes like sunrise, slow and terrible and inevitable. Jake saw the moment the doctor connected the stranger's face with the wanted posters outside, saw understanding replace confusion. "You're him," Dr. Henley breathed. "Blackwater, Jake Morrison." Jake's hand moved to his gun, but stopped. Timothy was watching him with fevered eyes, trusting and afraid. The boy had called him father in front of a witness, had claimed him as family in a way that made running impossible. "Please," Jake said again, but this time the word carried 20 years of regret. "He's just a boy. He ain't got nobody else." Dr. Henley stood frozen, his medical bag trembling in his hands. Outside, Jake could hear voices gathering, people drawn by some invisible current that always preceded trouble in small towns. Someone had recognized him. Someone had spread the word. Timothy reached for Jake again, his small fingers grasping at air. "Father, it hurts." The word came again, sealing both their fates. Jake moved to the bed, took Timothy's burning hand in his own rough palms, and felt his old life crumble away like desert dust. There would be no more running, no more hiding. Timothy had claimed him as father, and a father didn't abandon his child. "I'm here," Jake whispered, brushing damp hair from Timothy's forehead. "I'm right here, son." Through the window, Jake could see men gathering in the street. Sheriff's badges glinted in the afternoon sun, and the metallic sound of rifles being checked carried on the hot air. He was surrounded, trapped, finished. But looking down at Timothy's flushed face, Jake found he didn't care. Some words, once spoken, changed everything. Some bonds, once forged, couldn't be broken by bullets or badges or the weight of a man's bloody past. Timothy had called him father, and Jake Morrison, killer, outlaw, wanted man, had answered. Dr. Henley moved slowly to his medical bag, his eyes never leaving Jake's face. "The boy needs medicine. Cool baths to bring the fever down. Rest. Will he live?" Jake asked, and the question contained his whole world. "If he gets proper care, yes." The doctor paused, studying Jake with something that might have been understanding. A father's love can work miracles. Outside, Sheriff Coleman's voice rang clear and commanding. "Jake Morrison, we know you're in there. Come out with your hands up." Jake looked down at Timothy, who had drifted back in a fevered sleep, his small hand still gripping Jake's fingers. The boy's breathing was easier now, the medicine already working its magic. He would live, and Jake would make sure of it, no matter what it cost. The word father hung in the air between them like smoke from a dying fire, transforming everything it touched. Some words, Jake was learning, were more powerful than bullets. They could save a man's soul even as they sealed his fate. When a most wanted man in the West stepped into that dusty street with his hands raised and a sick boy clinging to his leg, the whole town learned that sometimes the difference between a killer and a hero is just one small word: father. Jake Morrison walked out of DR. Henley's office with his hands raised toward the desert sky and Timothy's small fingers wrapped around his leg. The boy's fever had broken, but he was still weak, still confused, still calling Jake the one word that had changed everything between them. Sheriff Coleman stood 30 feet away in the dusty street, his rifle trained on Jake's chest. Behind him, a dozen townspeople had gathered with their own weapons, their faces hard with the kind of justice that came swift and final in places like Mercy Creek. Jake recognized the look. He'd seen it in mirrors for 20 years. "That's far enough, Morrison," Coleman called out, his voice steady but not unkind. "Keep those hands where I can see them." Jake stopped walking but didn't let go of Timothy's hand. The boy pressed closer against his leg, frightened by the guns and the angry voices, but trusting Jake to keep him safe. That trust cut deeper than any bullet could. "Sheriff," Jake said, his voice carrying across the silent street like a prayer. "The boy's sick. He needs care. Whatever you aim to do with me, let DR. Henley tend to him first." Coleman's eyes flicked down to Timothy, then back to Jake. The sheriff was a middle-aged man with gray at his temples and lines around his eyes that spoke of hard decisions and sleepless nights. A father himself, if Jake read the signs right. The kind of man who understood what it meant to protect a child. "That your boy, Morrison?" Coleman asked. The question hung in the hot air like dust waiting to settle. Jake felt Timothy's grip tighten on his pants leg, felt the weight of 24 pairs of eyes watching his answer. Everything hinged on this moment. Everything he'd become in the past 3 months, everything Timothy meant to him, everything that mattered more than his own life. "Yes," Jake said, and the word came out strong and clear and true. "He's my son." A murmur ran through the crowd. Someone spat in the dirt. Someone else shifted his rifle to a better grip. But Sheriff Coleman just nodded, as if Jake had confirmed something he'd already suspected. "Funny thing," Coleman said, taking a step closer but keeping his weapon steady. "Got a telegram from Flagstaff yesterday. Said there was a train robbery 3 months back. Whole family killed except for one boy. Timothy Walsh, age 7. Parents were Frank and Margaret Walsh, traveling from Kansas to California." Jake's heart hammered against his ribs, but he didn't move. Didn't run. Timothy was listening to every word, and running would only teach the boy that love meant abandonment when things got dangerous. "That's right," Jake said. "I was there. Were you now?" Coleman's voice carried the weight of 20 years in law enforcement. And how exactly does a child whose parents were murdered by outlaws end up calling Blackwater Jake Morrison father? The crowd pressed closer, hungry for an explanation that would justify what they all wanted to do. Jake could see the hunger in their faces, the need for simple justice in a complicated world. But he also saw something else in Coleman's eyes. Doubt. Curiosity. The careful patience of a man who'd learned that the truth was usually more complex than it appeared. Timothy stepped forward then, his small voice cutting through the tension like a knife through silk. "He saved me," the boy said, looking up at Sheriff Coleman with those Creekwater eyes that had first stolen Jake's heart. "When the bad men killed my mama and papa, he found me. He could have left me there, but he didn't." DR. Henley emerged from his office, medical bag in hand. "Sheriff, if I may. The boy's been well cared for. Fed, clothed, loved. Whatever Jake Morrison was before, he's been this child's protector for months." "That don't change what he is," called out a voice from the crowd. "Killer's still a killer." Timothy's grip on Jake's leg tightened, and Jake saw fear flicker across the boy's face. Not fear of the guns or the angry voices, but fear that they might take his father away. Jake had seen that same fear in mirrors, in the faces of other orphans, in his own reflection 20 years ago. "You're right," Jake said, his voice carrying to every corner of the gathering crowd. "I'm a killer. Been running from that truth for 20 years. But this boy," he looked down at Timothy, at the trust and love shining in his young face. This boy taught me something I've forgotten. He taught me that what you've done ain't always who you are. That love can make a man better than his worst day. Sheriff Coleman lowered his rifle slightly. And what would you have me do with that, Morrison? Let you ride away? Pretend 20 years of blood don't matter? Jake shook his head. No, Sheriff. I ain't asking for mercy for myself. But Timothy, his voice cracked, and he had to swallow hard before continuing. Timothy deserves better than watching his father get shot down in the street. He's already seen too much death. The boy looked up at Jake with sudden understanding, his eyes filling with tears. You're not leaving me, are you? You promised you wouldn't leave me. Jake knelt down, bringing himself to Timothy's eye level despite the guns trained on his back. He took the boy's small hands in his rough ones and spoke words he'd never thought he'd have the right to say. Listen to me, Timothy. I love you. More than my own life, more than my own freedom. You're the best thing that ever happened to me, and being your father, even for just a few months, has been worth more than all the years before combined. Timothy threw his arms around Jake's neck, holding on tight. I love you too, Father. Don't let them take you away. Sheriff Coleman watched this exchange with the careful eyes of a man weighing justice against mercy, law against love. When he spoke again, his voice was softer. Jake Morrison, he said formally, you're under arrest for robbery and murder. Then, more quietly, but a man who'd risk capture to save a dying child, who'd raise an orphan with love and care. That man deserves consideration. Jake stood slowly, Timothy still clinging to his leg. What kind of consideration? Coleman holstered his weapon and pulled out a pair of iron shackles. Prison instead of a rope. A chance to watch your boy grow up, even if it's from behind bars. Maybe, after you've paid your debt, a chance to be the father he needs. The crowd murmured in disapproval, but Coleman's voice cut through their protests. That's my decision. Any man here wants to argue with it can take it up with Judge Harrison next month. As the shackles clicked around Jake's wrists, Timothy reached up and touched his face. Will I see you again, Father? Jake smiled, and for the first time in 20 years, it reached all the way to his eyes. Every visiting day they'll allow, son. I promise. Dr. Henley stepped forward, placing a gentle hand on Timothy's shoulder. The boy can stay with my wife and me until arrangements are made. He'll be cared for. As Sheriff Coleman led Jake toward the jail, Timothy called out one last time, I'll wait for you, Father, however long it takes. Jake turned back, memorizing the boy's face, storing up the image of his son standing brave and strong in the dusty street. I'll be worthy of that wait, he called back. I promise. The desert wind carried their words away into the gathering dusk, but some promises, Jake knew, were meant to be kept. Some loves were worth any price, and some fathers were made not by blood, but by choice, sacrifice, and the simple act of putting a child's needs before their own.